Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 3, Episode 15, 4 Things Holding You Back from Sexual Fulfillment. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex, as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. Hello, friends. Today I'm going to talk about 4 things that might be holding you back from receiving the joy and fulfillment that you deserve to have in your sexual relationships with your spouse. We have so much potential for immense pleasure and deep connection and empowerment through our sexual relationship, but there are several foundational shifts that need to occur for us to access this exceptional potential that we have. And the more I've gotten into this work, the more frustrating it can be and surprising just how foundational these little shifts can be for our connection in our marriages, but how they're not talked about and how little we know about them. And so today I want to talk about 4 of those things. There's more than 4, but we're going to just dive into 4 of them and give you a quick overview of some of the things that might be holding you back. And we're going to be talking more in depth about those things, plus more of the things that might be holding you back in my course that's going to be launching soon, From Pressure to Passion, for women who want to love sex with their husband. So I hope this will give you some insight into the things that might be holding you back. And if some of the things aren't holding you back, I hope that some of the other things you hear might be like, oh, that is something that I need to work on, or oh, that is something that I struggle with. And I hope that then you'll be able to start recognizing those patterns and limiting beliefs that are making it so that you can't fully lean into the joy and fulfillment that you deserve. Before jumping in, I just wanted to make sure that you've downloaded my free guide, Top 10 Things to Ask Your Spouse About Sex. It can be so tricky to know where to start these conversations and what type of questions will really dive deep in some of the issues or struggles that you are experiencing as a couple. So I've created this guide with 10 questions to get you started. If you don't know how to get these great conversations about sex started or what to ask, this guide is for you. You'll find 10 questions that are designed to help you open up the honest and vulnerable conversations you've been wanting to have. So take a quick break from listening, hop into the show notes, and click on my link to get your free download, Top 10 Things to Ask Your Spouse About Sex. And then we'll see you right back here. So today we're going to talk about 4 main things that might be holding you back from receiving the joy and fulfillment in sex that you deserve and the potential that you have. So here's the 4 things we're going to cover. Number 1, desire. A lot of us just aren't tapping into and understanding what desire is, what it looks like, and how desire works for us in our relationship. Number 2, we're going to dive into some of the beliefs about men that might be limiting our potential to really see our spouse as they are. Number 3, we're going to talk about losing ourselves in motherhood, in our marriages. This is a huge thing that often happens for women that limits their potential to really dive deep into their sexual relationship. And number 4, the definition of sex. Our definition of sex right now is so limiting and often leaves out what actually helps women feel pleasure in their sexual relationships. All right, so let's dive in and talk about number 1, desire, and some of the misconceptions that we have around desire. First off, a lot of us have grown up believing that sexual desire is something that just happens spontaneously. It just falls on us, and suddenly we're ready to have sex and we have desire to be with our partner and to connect sexually. Well, that's usually not true. And especially for women in committed long-term relationships. You may have previously felt desire, maybe before you got married or before you were sexual. And you might be wondering, what happened to my desire? Or you might be at a place where you're like, I actually have never really felt desire. I don't really know what it is or what it feels like. and I don't know how to access it. And all these things that people talk about of just feeling desire and being ready for sex do not resonate with me. Well, friend, you are not alone. I want to tell you about a researcher named Rosemary Basson, and I love what she did. She recognized that a lot of the traditional views we have around arousal and desire don't fit women. So, what we previously have known is from Masters and Johnson's research, and they talk about four aspects that are included in a sexual encounter. So, it starts off with excitement, and then there's this plateau, orgasm, and resolution. Well, the truth is, this type of sexual response is more accurate for men usually and doesn't often fit what occurs for women. And so when Rosemary Basson, she dug into this, she's like, what is happening for women? What are we seeing? What she realized is that often for women, the start of the sexual response cycle starts with a choice versus just this feeling of arousal or desire that falls on you. And so a lot of these women were choosing to step into a sexual encounter from another reason, right? From a reason of wanting to connect more deeply with their partner, from feeling love, possibly feeling disconnected from their partner. And so they wanted to have more emotional closeness. They wanted to bond. And I think that when we think about this, it's like, okay, Ariel, what? You're telling me that this is a choice that is so unromantic. But I actually think that this is something that can be really empowering and beautiful for us as women. We get to choose. We get to choose to move into the mood. We get to choose that we want to be close with our partner. And even though I can understand that that might feel a little bit frustrating at times to be like, oh, wait, what? It's not just going to happen. I think that it's a beautiful thing that then we get to learn what is going to help us move into the mood. And then together, you and your partner get to work with what you've learned to help you and him be ready to move into the mood. And of course, if this is opposite in your relationship, men can have more of what is often termed as responsive desire, right? Is what we're talking about, this choice and moving into the mood. If this is swapped, what we're talking about can still be helpful. But today we're going to focus on women because most often for women, they have responsive desire. So let's talk a little bit about arousal. So Emily Nagoski, she is a fantastic sex educator, and she believes that arousal actually happens first for everyone. And there's been this idea, I think, from Masters and Johnson, but that desire comes first and then arousal, right? But Emily Nagoski talks about that arousal comes first for everyone, but people have a different threshold for arousal and for desire. And so for someone with what seems spontaneous desire, their arousal and desire might be happening almost instantaneously at the same time. So when they start to feel physical arousal, they also feel desire. For people who have more of a responsive desire, it might take longer for their arousal to reach their threshold where they actually feel desire. And when we're talking about arousal, we can be talking about physical arousal, emotional arousal, mental arousal. And so for someone with responsive desire, what this is going to look like is figuring out what is going to help your arousal get to that threshold where you feel desire. And so this can start at the beginning of the day, right? This can be your spouse is leaving for work and they give you a nice long hug and a kiss. And then throughout the day, you and him are texting back and forth about things you appreciate about each other, or some sexy texts, some maybe experiences that you've had in the past sexually that were really enjoyable. So you're kind of helping yourself think more about sex and kind of start to move into the mood. Then when he gets home from work, or you get home from work, whatever it is, you and him are working together to take care of the house and the kids. Maybe you need some space. Maybe you need some time alone if you've been the caregiver all day and you need to go take a shower or read a book for a minute. Maybe you have a favorite love story, right? I think that romantic stories can be really helpful for responsive desire and for helping move in the mood. I'm a big fan of clean romance novels and just rereading your favorite chapter, right? That kind of gets you giddy and helps you move into the mood. It could be a wrestling match. Some of us might like to be a little more, fun, or it might be a deep conversation. It might be a back rub, starting to kiss. And then this can go more to the intimate touch and arousal. It might be starting to tickle, right? The inner thighs, your belly, your breast. and getting more aroused before we move to the clitoris. And so all of this is going to help with our arousal, and we need our mind to be there too, because we talked about emotional and mental. And so some of the emotional might be, I actually need to decompress. I need to just let you know all the things I'm thinking about and get that off my plate so that I can focus on this moment where we're at right now. For the emotional, it might be having a deeper conversation. It might be sharing something that you've been feeling nervous about or something you're embarrassed about, kind of taking that step into vulnerability and authenticity that can be so scary. That might be what is going to help you connect emotionally. As this arousal is happening in your body and mentally, emotionally, then you might reach wherever that's at for you, this desire threshold. And I think it's really important just to recognize that you do not have to feel desire before you start moving into the mood and before you start working on your arousal. And I think a lot of us have this misconception that before we can move into a sexual encounter, we need to boom, feel desire, and then we'll start going. But I think understanding this and understanding what Rosemary Basson talked about is this shift that we get to make a choice and we get to learn what is going to help us reach that desire threshold through arousal. And so as you start to uncover that, it's going to be easier and easier for you and your partner as you're practicing this to know what is going to help you reach that arousal threshold and that desire threshold to move into the mood. Okay, so let's move on to number 2. We have these kind of beliefs about male sexuality that can be really limiting and hurtful for our intimate relationships. And so some of these have been passed down to us through generations of misunderstandings about male sexuality. And a lot of these show up in when you're dating and it's like, oh, be careful. He's only after one thing. Men, all they want is sex. You know, some of these comments that we hear and some of these gender stereotypes that men are the ones who initiate, they're the ones who are always ready to have sex, and this belief that sex is about how our bodies look. So these misconceptions can be really harmful because they paint men as so shallow and they limit us as seeing our partner as someone who has deep feelings, who has needs, who wants to connect with us in a deep way, not just to get off and orgasm. It also limits our ability to show up sometimes in our body, because if we believe that our partner's sexual arousal and desire is based solely on how our body looks, then as our bodies change, as we age, as we have babies, this can be really hard to recognize that their sexual desire to be with us is based on so many more deep things than just how our bodies look. And so I think the first step is to recognize that a lot of these things are myths. And we get to talk with our partner about this because we both grew up in this culture and society that talks about and shows men as being more sexual. There's this belief that men are more sexual. They're the ones who are always wanting it. And so some of our partners may have fallen into these traditions. And so we as a partnership get to talk about and uncover what is actually happening. What are you actually feeling as the man in the relationship? Do you actually want sex all the time, or do you feel pressure to show up that way because that's how our society has portrayed it? And if I initiate, do you feel pressure that you have to have sex with me at this moment, or else I'm going to feel like my body's not good enough or that you don't love me? And we all have times where we're too overwhelmed, we're too exhausted, we're too frustrated that it's not maybe sexual intimacy that we need, but first we need just to connect or decompress or get more sleep. And so I think just recognizing that we're both human, we have these things and these myths that are carried into our relationship that can negatively affect how we show up. Some of the ways that this might be showing up is out of duty sex. Like, okay, I'm married, my husband needs sex, right? This is one of those myths that sex is a need for men. And so as a wife, it's my duty to make sure that he is sexually fulfilled. Or the same myth that sex is a need for men can be really fear-based, that if we aren't making sure that our husband is fulfilled sexually, he is going to look somewhere else. He's going to go to pornography, he's going to have an affair. And so we need to make sure that he is fulfilled. And so these myths can be really harmful because instead of operating out of love and a desire to feel connection, we're operating out of fear or duty. And that is like the worst way for women to actually feel desire and to want to engage sexually, to be able to be more connected if it's out of fear and duty. That is not going to produce the type of sexual intimacy that we hope to have in our relationships. So, if any of the things that I mentioned in this section of the episode resonate with you about beliefs that you have, I want you to start talking about those with your partner and figure out, are these serving us and are these myths true? Are they operating? Do they need to be true if they are operating? How can we shift these myths in our relationship to beliefs that actually serve us and strengthen our relationship? Okay, let's talk about this idea of losing yourself in wifehood or motherhood that can often happen for women. From a very young age, women are often encouraged to look outward, to take care of others, to serve others, to make sure and be inclusive and kind. And all of those things that I mentioned are amazing things. You're like, wait, Ariel, those are good things. Yes, they are so good. And it's so beautiful that we can work on developing those things in our life. But I think the issue comes that we're so focused on women having those attributes and having them all the time that sometimes as women, when we move into wifehood or motherhood, we don't think about ourselves anymore. We don't recognize ourselves as this full person who has needs and passions apart from our spouse or our children. We sometimes become this person who feels like we need to be always making sure that our husband is taken care of, that his needs are taken care of. We need to be making sure our kids are where they need to be and what they need to be. And we always need to be available. And so we're not taking care of ourselves in a consistent way that keeps us healthy and helps us be able to thrive in our relationship. And so if you're thinking, okay, I can see this, I can see that maybe I kind of fall into this idea of giving, giving, giving all of the time and not having a self anymore. So how does this affect our sex life, right? This idea shows up in our sexual relationship that when we are always looking out for others and always focusing on them in our sex life, we will kind of fall into what we talked about in the last section about duty sex, about having sex as a way to serve instead of as a way for us to be equal partners, and that sex is for both of us. Sex is to bind both of us together. It's to empower both of us. It's to be joyful and pleasurable for both of us. When we fall into this serving attitude, we're not focused on our own pleasure. We are only focused on our spouses. And of course, that's important. We need our sexual encounters to be good for both of us, but it's also really important for women to be able to focus more on what is happening in their bodies. Most men can go from the very beginning of arousal and desire to orgasm in like 5 minutes or less. And for women, most often, this takes a lot longer. This can be 20 minutes. And research even talks about this idea that really great sexual encounters are even 30 to 60 minutes. And so for most women, it takes more time and effort because we need to be focused mentally, emotionally, physically. And so I really think that in sexual encounters, it is a space as women that often we need to allow our partner to focus on us. We need to allow ourselves to focus on us so that we can be present and know what's happening in our body. There's some really interesting research that talks about that most women rate their sexual satisfaction based on what their partner is feeling and if he is satisfied. And I think that this is really telling in the way that a lot of us as women think about our sex lives. We focus on our partner. We want to make sure he is fulfilled. We want to make sure that he feels loved and feels connection. But when our sex life isn't a partnership, when we are only focused on our partner's fulfillment, eventually this is going to lead to resentment and feeling unfulfilled. And it's really important that we are partners, that we are equals in our relationship, and that our sex life is for both of us. And so this is going to take some changes that we start focusing and prioritizing our satisfaction and our sexual enjoyment during these encounters and talking with our partner about that. We need this to be good for both of us. And I know some of you are thinking, oh no, maybe I've been faking for years, or maybe I haven't been prioritizing this. How do I bring this up with my partner? I think that there's often going to be some emotional hurt, right? When some of these things are brought up. But I think it can be brought up in a way that can be kind and sensitive and recognize I don't want to hurt you, but I've realized from some things I've been learning that I haven't been prioritizing my sexual fulfillment. And I want sex to be a beautiful part of our relationship. Let's start talking about what we can do to make this a beautiful part of our relationship for me and for you. What have you been noticing? What's good for you? And share and start these conversations and start talking about them. You are capable of immense sexual pleasure and deep connection, and you and your partner can make it a beautiful thing for both of you. So let's dive into number 4 on this same vein that we're talking about your potential and immense potential for sexual pleasure. I mean, we think about men as being more sexual and liking sex more, but honestly, women have more potential, I believe, because we can have multiple orgasms back to back. Whereas men have this refractory period where after they've orgasmed, it takes some time before they can again. So we just have so much potential, but the definition of sex can be so limiting. If someone were to ask you, hey, did you have sex last night? What's the first thing that comes into your head? First, like, wait, why are you asking me this? But second, I think a lot of us would only acknowledge that we had had sex the previous night if intercourse had occurred. And so often we think of sex and intercourse as synonymous. But when we do, we leave out female pleasure. For most women, orgasm does not happen from intercourse alone. There has to be other stimulation occurring. And this focuses on the clitoris. The clitoris is the hanky panky, as Emily Nagoski says, like it is the key to physical pleasure for women's sexuality. But I mean, think about that. When did you even learn that you had a body part named the clitoris? And if you had heard the word clitoris before and you had heard about this body part, when did you actually know where it was and its purpose? That the only reason it exists is for sexual pleasure. Like they don't know any other reason why the clitoris exists. But when did you learn about that? I was in my 20s. I may have actually even been married before I heard the word clitoris. Like this wasn't something that I knew about. This wasn't a body part that I knew. Whereas we look at men and from a very young age, they know they have a penis, they can see it, whereas the clitoris is more internal. Only the little glands at the very end, the tip of the clitoris, we can even see, right? The rest is internal. But for men, their pleasure center, the penis is visible. And from a young age, they're even encouraged to touch it when they use the bathroom or things like that. Whereas for women, it's often like, oh, it's dirty, don't touch your vulva. And most of us didn't even know we had a vulva. It was called a vagina. So there's so many things that limit us as women because we don't even know our body parts. And when intercourse is synonymous with sex, and that's the way most men are able to orgasm, it leaves out what helps us feel the most pleasure. And we don't know how to access that because we often assume that, well, okay, men usually feel the most pleasure through intercourse. I guess that must be the way I feel the most pleasure. And so we keep trying to have intercourse to feel pleasure, but it might not be working. And this can depend, of course, on the placement of your clitoris. Sometimes intercourse is at a place that your clitoris is stimulated. But I think this definition needs to be changed to include female pleasure because when we think of sex only as intercourse, it limits our ability as women to understand that there is more to sex than intercourse. And especially for your pleasure as a woman, it needs to include more than just intercourse. And so I think this can start some really helpful conversations in your relationship to figure out what do we want to define sex as? What do we want to include in this definition of sex? What things are pleasurable for you as the woman in the relationship? And let's make sure that those are all included in our definition of sex. And even I say, sometimes we might need to just totally scrap the word sex because it's too tainted and just too synonymous with intercourse that maybe in our relationship, we are going to call it making love or love making, right? We can even change the word to include and make that word define what we want our sexual interactions to include, what is pleasurable for you and what is pleasurable for me and what is going to help us connect on this deep and vulnerable level. So let's just quick recap. Here's the 4 things we talked about today that might be holding you back from living up to the joy and fulfillment you deserve. The joy and fulfillment that you can have in sex. The first one was desire, our misunderstanding of what desire is, what it looks like. The second are some of these beliefs that we have about men that are so limiting and often myths that don't serve our relationship and help us access that deeper connection. Number 3 was losing ourselves in motherhood and not really being able to bring our authentic self and focus on ourselves in our sexual encounters. And the 4th one was the definition of sex, that it often leaves out female pleasure. I hope you go away today feeling empowered to believe that you have so much potential. I think that's been one of the most frustrating things that has happened as I've studied more and learned more throughout my years, looking for answers for myself of how can I access this deep fulfillment and potential and empowerment that I believe we can have in sex. And then also just all the research and things I gathered. I think the thing that has been most frustrating is how simple it can actually be, that this knowledge can be so accessible, and just a couple shifts in our beliefs and the way that we are interacting with our own sexuality and sex in our relationship can transform the way we feel about sex and the joy and fulfillment we have. But we aren't able to access this because it's not readily accessible. And that's one reason I have been putting together my course From Pressure to Passion, because I don't want you to have to go through the years of trying to figure out what is going to help and how you can access the joy and fulfillment that you deserve. I want it to be easy for you to access and really make those fundamental shifts that will help you lean into the rejuvenation and the joy and the empowerment that you can have with your husband in this beautiful part of your relationship. And so I hope that covering these 4 things will help start some good conversations with your partner to start to make the shifts that you both need to really lean into the deep connection that you can have. And if you haven't already, please go download my top 10 things to ask your spouse about sex that will help start some of these conversations around the things that we talked about and really open up some honest conversations that will help you dive into some of the struggles that you have and some of the things that you want to integrate into your sex life to make it beautiful for both of you. As always, I'm so grateful to have you as part of this community and to learn together with you and to work on making the world a better place for women's sexuality. As always, thanks for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, and our miscellaneous task was Jana Norman.